Hello and welcome to episode 119 of The Imperial Truth. I'm your host Greg, and as usual, before we go anywhere else, let's talk about Element Games. At the moment, if you want to play 40k, you want to collect Primaris, there are plenty of Space Marine releases coming. We've had a few and we know there are more coming. Also, Games Workshop have actually taken some of their what used to be GW only releases. I think some of the Hobbit stuff got given out that third parties are allowed to sell it now. So that's something to be aware of, that if you are getting something that might have been GW web store only or what have you, that some of those, and I don't know which ones, so I can't help you out, might be worth checking third party, but you can get all your plastic crack from Element Games. And if you want to support the show, you can head through the advert on theimperialtruth.com or find the link that is in the show notes or is put up on Twitter and Facebook. And we get a kickback for that. So thank you for those people who've used it and for those who are thinking about using it. As I say, it's just me for the first part of the show. I seem to be saying it all the time at the moment, but life really busy. We've had trying to get things ready for the Reckoning of Dalen Prime event that's going on next weekend as of recording, but also Blood and Glory tickets have actually gone up for the 30k event, for the Age of Darkness event. A couple of days after this comes out, the Adeptus Titanicus tickets should be up, and the Friday event. Unfortunately, I've still got some bits to do to actually get the packs up online, but hopefully it will be the kind of thing you guys love. We try and make the events work for how people like to play, like to change things up, but there's a bit of a winning formula there already, so it doesn't make sense to change things too much. But it's good to finally get those tickets up. Really looking forwards to Blood and Glory, and can't wait to get on that one. Just a quick reminder, those dates are 2nd and 3rd, I believe it is, of November, the first weekend of November. There will be Friday events, and then over the 2 days, the weekend, we'll have 30k and Adeptus Titanicus. Limited tickets, particularly Adeptus Titanicus. So if you are interested, keep an eye on social media, and when those, as I say, fingers crossed, they'll be up already, so go and check them out. If they're not up, they will be up very soon. And if you are into Adeptus Titanicus, I thought I might as well put it in here. We have one of the sister shows to this show is Full Stride, which has its own feed. So if you're into Adeptus Mechanicus, you can go over Adeptus Titanicus. You can go over to Full Stride, find it on iTunes, and use all your podcatchers or whatever. And it's through a Libsyn feed as well. So we've got 5 episodes in, doing one a month essentially from now on. And that's been enjoyable. So, and that's why we don't do a huge amount of Adeptus Titanicus on this show, which is a mixed blessing in and of itself. But it allows people who only play Adeptus Titanicus to have that feed for them. So, if that's your thing, please go and head over there. Matt, my co-host on that, a lot of people will know in the UK, Matt Woodsmith. He's a cracking guy, does a really good job. So I've been enjoying doing that. And as I say, in my time here, I've been trying to get ready for the Reckoning of Dalen Prime. We've actually I got a load of terrain that has been sponsored by Dark Fantastic Mills for the event. There's going to be a table of Zone Mortalis terrain, and unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to get it painted because I've just had too much stuff taken up the time, and it's one of those things that I meant to do. I kind of put aside that I would try and do them in the last 2 weeks, but I don't think I did any hobby in the evenings, or very little hobby in the evenings last week. Just by the time I kind of got to sit down and organised, it was too late. I almost had to go to bed, and that's partly bad organisation on my part. Something I'm going to try and get a little bit better at, even if it's that hour or half an hour a day to get in and do something. The problem, I think, part of it is when you've got a big project, the thought of just doing half an hour on it, you think, well, what one we're going to get done in half an hour? You talk yourself out of it, and that's the wrong way to look at things. But that's sometimes how my brain works. I've got to try and get my brain thinking, well, that's half an hour less, or even because sometimes it's literally you've only got about half hour. Sometimes it's, well, let's try and find a half hour amongst the things I'm doing, and actually once you've started you can get 45 minutes or an hour out of it. So that's something I've got to get better at, but we're going to have it there. I say it's been sprayed, I think. Maybe I can get something done this week. We'll have a look, but I'm not holding out my breath on that. But it's a fantastic 3D printed Zone Mortalis-esque terrain, so I'll be taking that up, and we'll be having a table full of that, and I've got quite a lot of stuff as well, hopefully, so it should look good. But I've got that, and then also keeping an eye on Company of Legends coming up. That will soon be upon us, so I've got some painting to do for my talents for that as well. But amongst getting everything else done, these things sometimes hold back. Yeah, fingers crossed it will still look good. And at Firestorm, they've got plenty of terrain. We will be able to make up our tables and hopefully make them look really good. Just starting to get, as I say, all the little bits and pieces together for that. There's not a huge amount, thankfully, but still, stuff takes time. And on top of that, as I say, I've been getting Blood and Glory stuff done as well. And within all that, I haven't actually had that much time to read either. I put a question out, asked for questions for this show on Twitter and Facebook, and got some questions in, and had to actually go and look at Book 8, because it's not one I've actually sat down with and spent a huge amount of time with still, even after all that rush to get it out. It's I don't know, I need a time manager, or I need a new job, one of the two. It's we'll sort something out on one of those fronts. I'm positive of that. One thing I do know for sure is running events next year is something where I want to mix up what I've been doing with independent events. I think there's my individual events, should I say, outside of the conventions, and there's stuff I feel that I've said this before, but other events have certainly taken over and gone past what I did. It's quite funny still to see some of the wordage hasn't changed on a lot of events from those first time I really put out a new style of pack. But definitely what some of the guys are doing out there is fantastic. And realistically, by myself, I'm not going to be able to do that. So what I need to do is get one or two people together moving forwards and have that joint effort that is required to get that right for future events. If otherwise, there's nothing wrong per se with the events that I'm running. I think Reckoning should go fine. It should be a fun event, but I'm looking at maybe taking that to another level. But I almost need to kind of get Reckoning out of the way and sit down and actually have a proper look at what the hope is moving forwards. And these things do take time, and some of the things you think are going to be wonderful don't always pan out. Talking to some guys who ran a mixed event recently, and whether one of those guys has already said they're going to pare back on a few bits they're doing, but all depends how you run it. There's so many variables in what you're doing, and it all takes effort to put in. I don't think it's hard work to put an event on, but it takes a lot of work. It's not difficult, but you have to put time and effort into doing that, and that's part of what you take on when you do it. But it takes time away from everything else, and when you are rushed and it is down to just you, you're going to let things slip them more than if there was more than one of you, 2 or 3 helping to run it. So we'll see moving forwards. That's kind of where I am on that kind of side of things. But let's leave all that. I think we could talk about releases, but I think all we got was the Warp Missile pack, or rack, should I say, for Adeptus Titanicus for Reaver, which is, although really cool, not necessarily a go-to weapon in terms of being effective, but can be fun. It's actually something I want to play around with a bit more. I need to get kind of a solid period of playing some Adeptus Titanicus in to try out loads of different stuff, because there's loads of cool stuff that I haven't really played with yet. It's just, It's the problem with being the omni gamer. There's way too many games and way too little time to enjoy them all the way you want to. But yeah, that's heresy. Release is done. We don't get a huge amount, bless us, but we're plugging away. Although I can't remember if the Dark Angels are out actually. Now I've said that, we did get the 2 Dark Angels, the general. I think they were last time. I could be wrong. And the Dark Angel stuff is looking fantastic. I know some people thought we were going to be getting the White Sky straight afterwards, but I think due to the fact that we're not getting this, we can't expect a constant stream of releases. They are going to spread them out over a set period, so we need to have expectations in that way. We're looking at a release schedule of something every 3 months, or 3 weeks, sorry, roughly. Spread around. It's, Lord of the Rings, and then it's Specialist, and then it's Dectus Titanicus. It doesn't quite work out exactly like that, but I think if you sit yourself on something like that and knowing that it might take 4 weeks, might be 2 weeks, then you won't be too disappointed. So before I ramble on way too much on that, let's go to some of the questions that got asked. Well, I think I only had questions from Facebook, which is interesting. I didn't put it up on Instagram. I probably should have. That's my own fault, and I only put it up yesterday. So I didn't expect to be completely undated, and I had a few good ones. And as I say, there were a couple I had to go and kind of look up and read up about. But yeah, let's start. So we got Jack Brodel. What do I think of units designed for campaign weekends? Now, this is one of those things. I don't necessarily think I'm the average gamer in terms of the way I look at packs. In some ways I am, for sure. I never read the pack properly before I get into an event. And I have a go at people for doing that so much, but that is such a common thing. And that plays into part of this, actually. I think they're great for a narrative. They're fantastic. There are certain aspects that we know, like assassins were around and things like that, and even making up characters and centurion types that are allowed to fill in gaps or provide extra narrative, as I said, are really cool. However, there's something about having a model on the table that you're completely not familiar with. Now, if I go and play, let's see, what kind of legions haven't I played recently? If I go and play a Solar Auxilia player, we used to have one at the club, but he used certain of their toys and didn't use others. If I went and just rocked up and someone was using a unit that I'd never seen before, which didn't look like it fit any specific role, I'd be like, oh, what do they do? What do I have to look out for them? That kind of thing. And we have to have that conversation. That's not a problem. If you've got these written up units, unless some people have gone through the pack and read them, then there is that possibility that it causes that confusion in the game. So I think you've got to be a little bit careful. I don't put them into mine for various reasons. Partly for that, partly because we all like to talk about the rules. I'll put myself in this instance. We like to talk about the rules. We like to talk about what's good, what's not good, what works, what doesn't work, and everything else. I don't know how balanced any of these entries are, and there is, although balance isn't the key, balance is a reasonable aspect of gaming, and particularly when you're trying to bring a lot of different people together. If you know that all the options are inherently balanced, then you have you're much more likely to find games that sit within a certain corridor of acceptability. You're not getting someone bringing absolute tosh and someone bringing the absolute filth, and the game's being over by turn one. So there is balance, can be an element, although I don't think it's the overriding element. They're a lot of work as well. I mean, you can go and steal people's, and that's fine. I suggest it. If someone's written up an assassin character and you think that's cool, I'd like that to be an option in my thing. Maybe ask them, just take it. Asking can be fine, but I think most of us, who create stuff like that are more than happy for it to be used once it's out in the wider world. You can't stop it being used anyway, but I think most of us are happy for people to go and borrow it. So it's a weird one. I remember being handed a character for Jungles of a Car, I think it was, and so this was being handed a character, which I've done in my events before, and I had the problem other people did. I hadn't used anything like that before, missed off half its rules, didn't use it how it was supposed to be used. So the event organisers got this idea that this characters can do this, and therefore it can be used in this way by this person, and you give it to that person, they don't understand it, which happens a lot because it's not the way they normally do things, or it's just they've got enough on their plate looking at other stuff, and then it's kind of wasted. I think the way of doing it where you can buy them into your army is probably a better way, or keeping it very simple. And in fact, even if you're buying it into your army, keeping it very simple is probably the better method. And I would say if the rules are going one way or the other, they're better to be slightly worse than they should be than be slightly better. The last thing you need is people to walk away from the event going, "Oh, it was really fun," except for Unit X kept smashing me up. It was so undercosted and blah blah blah. That puts a bit of a sour taste in people's mouths. If I walk away from an event and Unit X had performed really badly for me, I'm like, well, that's my fault. I chose and put it in my army. I did not have to pay the points to do that. So yeah, a bit of a mixed kind of thing. For me though, the big problem is I'd need to read that pack early enough to kind of know how I'm going to use them, and then maybe make a model, because you might not even have something that you feel or realistically could represent that model either. So if I'm looking at that pack a day before list submission, 2 weeks from the event, realistically, have I got enough time to build it, paint it? Do I want to spend the money doing that? That's another issue as well. So they're cool, but used sensibly. And one thing I have seen, actually, I will say, is a couple of times I've seen it in other instances, other games, where people kind of then make this statement, well, these units are used here, let's make them available everywhere. And it's like, well, no, this is my event. And I want to run it a certain way, and there are reasons to include them and reasons not to include them. I think people have to be a bit, remember that not everyone gets on board with these things as well. So they can, I suppose the attitude towards them can be a little bit funny, because people see the game, see life differently. They see things differently. And there's an excitement that goes with these kind of things. It's not always felt by everyone. And I'm sometimes in that latter category. So moving on. Ben Ide asked the question, if I could change one Legion specific unit, which one? And I suppose there's a few. The question is, how would you change them? That's a lot harder to answer. I think one of my most frustrating units is Fire Drakes, purely just because of how tough they are, but then they're that... Well, it's not purely because of how tough they are. I'm cool. They're tough. That's fine by me. It's how many points they then sink, and then how the army then develops from that. So I don't necessarily think it's like the greatest army that's ever lived or anything like that, but there is a definite kind of all eggs in one basket approach that can be really easy to dive into with salamanders, and they are tough boys. I think just coming down a smidge in there, but then how do you do it? It's hard. The one thing a D6 system doesn't have is that granularity within it. So you knock them down by, essentially it's two wounds, 3 up armor save, a 3 up invulnerable save, 2 up armor save is if you knock any one of those stats down, then it has a dramatic effect. So I don't know how you do it, but maybe something could be done in there. I generally think most are fine. Up until recently, it might have said Thousand Suns, the Sekhmet Terminators, but they've had changes there and haven't played against them a huge amount since. Farragear Terminators, I think they seem to be a bit of a mixed up unit. Doesn't really quite know how it wants to sit. Liked it. I mean, they got a lot more options, so maybe that's not fully right, but something about them doesn't quite maybe fit right. But they're cool. So I think Forge will do a pretty good job of making these things feel right. I don't know. I don't think any are like every now and then I sit there and think, oh, Grave Wardens are pretty hardcore, and they are. But then I've never had a major issue with them. And just thinking through, they've made changes to things like Ashen Circle, brought them into line, maybe making Night Lords I can't remember what they're called now, but giving them a bit of a boost, maybe a small. But again, I think it's fine margins before you go too far the other way, and I haven't really studied them in a long time, so making that decision is quite difficult. Right then, Pete Alexander M asked, which element from 40k would you bring to Age of Darkness? Paraphrasing his question, but then Chris Carr also asked, if you could change 3 rules, what would they be and why? So I'll probably answer these together. So 3 rules is quite a big, quite a wide. There's so many to choose from. I think anyone who's listened to this more than one episode will know that I think degradation of vehicles, specifically super heavy vehicles, should be a thing. There should be some system, and now don't necessarily mean it should be a direct port from 40k, but some system whereby scoring a penetrating hit and rolling a 6 on that, or at least having a really strong weapon score a very good hit on a super heavy should have more effect than it does, even if it's just half hull points. Something happens, you lose some of that abilities, or what have you. Something within the super heavy vehicle realm I think needs to change. Personally, moving on from that second one, hit allocation. This is tricky. So you've got 2 extremes. You've got well, not extremes, should I say, but you've got 40k where the owning player chooses which of his models die. I think with the exception that if you roll a specific save that's only on certain models, then they're the only ones that can be taken off until. So if you've got Age of Sigmar is similar in that respect. If you've got an invulnerable save on 3 out of 10 models and you choose to use those saves, then those models have to be taken off. I believe, I could be wrong, but you go from taking your own models off to taking whichever model is the closest. And when it's written like that, it's fine. My problem is then when you get Artificer Armour on a champion and he absorbs 20, 30, 40 bolt gun shots. Sometimes you just get lucky. And then you make your lookout sirs on every las cannon shot that comes in and kills a grunt so that you can then take the next 10 bolt gun shots. I think it can be frustrating and it just doesn't fit right with me. So I think that's something that could be looked at going forwards. Again, what the answer is, I'm not 100% sure on that one. I think it's a little bit tricky and I wouldn't be surprised if it stays roughly the same. But we'll see. It's tricky at the end of the day. It's all about getting that balance right. And actually, the third rule could be, and the problem is isolating one rule and changing it sometimes is not enough. So with super heavy vehicles degrading, that would be fine. But in this case, you'd need to change other rules around it. But the strength and AP system of weapons, I think part of the problem with vehicles, you can get these all or nothing games, and sometimes that carries over. Things like, actually it's probably like Mechanicum are a problem or were a problem at the start, particularly because people didn't take guns that deal with fighting against Mechanicum. They took guns which dealt with fighting against Marines, and that generally meant AP3 and less shots. Now, as a Mechanicum player, when that person comes along with autocannons and heavy bolters, it becomes a different story, because they're AP4, which is generally what you need to get rid of all the smaller stuff and some of the big stuff as well. High enough strength to still hurt and a few more shots. So the game becomes a little bit rock, paper, scissors in that respect, in terms of what people are bringing. One thing 40k has with its minuses to armor saves, which used to be quite common, is weapons have a bit more utility. So a heavy bolter will still threaten, but a Space Marine player, but not as much as an autocannon would, not as much as a las cannon, that kind of aspect. And you have to make those judgments about what weapons you're taking. So it gives you more viability in that you can still use it well in roles. It will have less of an ability. It will be obviously better against certain targets than other targets. And what it means is you'll see more variety of weapons if they're made the right way. The downside of that can be that one weapon becomes the best weapon all the time. So, yeah, actually, would I want it changed? I don't know. That one's a really difficult one for me. I think there are values in having the 40k system, and variety is an aspect of that. And it also gives you a bit more design space, I think, because you don't have to necessarily rely. There's still ways of making vehicles, making weapons really good against vehicles or really good against infantry. Things like changing the damage output between like an infantry and a vehicle weapon. There's stuff that can be done in that respect. And there are lots of little rules we've seen that affect armour in ways. So there's stuff that can be done. I don't know, maybe I've talked myself out of that though. It's a really tricky one, and it just shows you, again, fundamentally, I'm not a games designer. I play the games, I understand them to a point. What I do know is as soon as you start changing something, it has many knock-on effects, and seen this through years of comping Warhammer events, things like that, where they've wanted to restrict something, that invariably you just make something else better. So it's not always easy to do. Then we had two other quite similar questions. We had Mike Fellhounded, how would you change destroyers, essentially? And then John Sheeb, how do you use destroyers? How do you make them better? Or do you just end up using black shields and having destroyers within that? So we're going to answer that second one first, in a weird way. I think if you're building your army purely on how effective it is, then I'm not necessarily playing that kind of game. So I don't really know what my answer is there. Like, if you want to play black shields, then play black shields. If you want to play legions and you don't feel that destroyers do anything for you, then don't take them. But I wouldn't change my whole army just to play destroyers. So it's not really a question I can answer in that respect. Now, how would I change destroyers? Well, this was a different thing. I had to go and look up, because of course their rules are in the FAQ now as well. The errata, where they've been updated and reduced in points already. And basically the question was, why would you take these elites rather than, most people end up taking veterans? So how do you change that? The first thing to remember, I think, is that these have a role. They have a narrative that goes with them, and that narrative is, they carry the weapons. That they're the resort that other people don't want to have to make. They're allowed the stuff that is normally discouraged and everything else. They're allowed phosphex bombs and rag grenades and all that. So we don't want to kind of get away from that. We also want to remember that in doing so, these guys aren't expected to survive as long as normal Marines. They suffer for their art, as it were, and that should be part of them. When we compare them, say, to veterans, veterans are given all the good stuff because they prove themselves and they've got 2 attacks that they've been around a while, and we've got to get that balance again in their rules, so that you don't want your black shields to act like veterans. You don't your destroyers to act like veterans. You don't want your veterans to act like destroyers. And the first thing you look at when they're right next to each other on the page on in the red book to look at their rules. Veterans have all the options in the world, and destroyers have a handful. Their weapons choices are all pistols except for the heavy bolter with the suspended web, and it only gets rad grenades. It's the only grenades it can have, or missiles. So that they have a different role in that, and I think you've got to potentially keep that. One thing I did think of was maybe having 2 missile launchers per. Sorry, did I say heavy bolter? It's 2 missile launchers per 5 models. Could be quite good. You could have this unit which, rather than getting up close, is launching rad waste from afar, which could be quite cool. And I could see them having a little role doing that, having a squad here or there. But that kind of goes away from the rest of the squad only having these pistols. So they look like a squad that should be getting up and dirty with someone. So actually maybe expanding that list of allowing a few more weapons in there, but you've got to be careful when you're doing that, because are these also the kind of people that legions will be kitting out with loads of stuff if they're getting in and doing all the dirty work? Probably not as much. So there's a little bit of a balance in there. One thing I did think is these are guys, and there's one of the earlier short stories, not earlier, but midway through short stories about some destroyers actually. Like, they know they're not going to live as long as other people. They know they're doing the dirty work and that people don't like them and stuff like that. Within reason, obviously, there are different ways of doing this. Blood Angels approach their destroyers in a different way. I kind of would like to see some morale bonus where they don't maybe get panicked as easily. That could be quite cool. This kind of attitude of them doing what they're doing. They know the risks, and they know what's expected and everything else. And maybe something like that, or even a feel no pain, where I'm trying to remember exactly how I came up with the idea for that, but again, kind of resigned to that attitude that if the enemy don't get them, the constant closeness to rad grenades will, and so they push on through. Again, it's tricky. They're in that weird place. And it's sad because the heresy is about Marines. Unfortunately, we're in a game system where anyone with 3-up armor save isn't particularly great. You've got to have something to make you stand out. Vets have all those. They're the special rule that they can pick. They have options to every single gun you can think of, so you can really make your squad do what you want it to do. And they're implacable, which means they score. Now, I don't think destroyers should be implacable, but that's a pretty huge negative compared to the vets, particularly when a lot of people end up with 2 or 3, core troop units that are scoring. So they suddenly think, oh, okay, in my elites, I can take this squad, which not only outflanks or what have you, but is also scoring. It becomes really hard to look past. If you put jetpacks on the back of destroyers, there aren't, apart from 1 or 2 lists, Day of Revelation, something like that, where you've got full on, the theme of it is for jetpack guys, then, again, it's guys in 3-up armor save who move a bit quicker, and who, when they get closer to you, don't scare you that much because they might have some plasma pistols, and their champion might have a special rule. Like, if they had, even if it was the odd power axe or something else in there, I don't think you're ever scared when destroyers attack you. So I think it needs to be a handful of things. I think almost a special rule somewhere along the line would be more beneficial to keep it in line, but I don't know what it is. Maybe you guys have got an opinion. Maybe you guys have played with stuff. I don't know. feel free to let us know. I think fundamentally the fact that they're not scoring and vets have so many options means it's really hard to look past these guys unless you make them super cheap or you just really want them in your army. And how cheap do you make stuff before it becomes a bit silly? So that's a tricky one, I think, all round to try and make them work. Or maybe you change rad. Maybe you get a different rule for the weapons they carry, for the rad weapons. Maybe we can up that a little bit in their instance, come up with a new terminology. Or maybe you think there's no problem with them. I don't know. But yeah, I think they're a real tricky one, actually. It's one I kind of had to get the book out and look at, and I was like, oh, well, you could do this. And then the more I looked at it, the more I was like, does that really fit? I like the idea that they won't get panicked. They don't take panic tests. I think that's maybe like a grim resolve that they have when they're doing that role. I think that could help because it's one less thing to worry about. It's not a massive bonus, but it's just that little thing. But yeah, kind of stumped me a little bit. And again, I don't write rules, so we leave that to other people to come up with. I don't know if I've even answered your question, Mike, but that there's one or two things in there that I think need to be or can be looked at. That I say the danger is just turning them into veterans or another unit type, and there's no point doing that. So, but I like the idea. I think the idea might be more esoteric weaponry. So yes, I've got rad grenades and rad missiles. I think maybe even a new gun. Something like that, or a new way of maybe like the equivalent of a rad flamer or something like that could give these guys a role which they do supremely better than everyone else, because that's what you need at the end of the day to make people take them. And then we had one of the most important questions of the lot. A certain Anuj asked, if I could take him out for dinner, what kind of food would we eat? I think we'd go for a roast. I think I'm far too traditionally English for my own good, and a bit of roast beef or roast pork would go down sound. So yep, if you're up for that, Anuj, although I won't take you out because I won't be able to pay. So we might have to go Dutch on that one, I'm afraid. And the last question was from Grant Wills. What do you think of the Centurion Light rules from Book 8? So these are the Deception Phase Army list building sections. So it's page 184 of Book 8. I think it's the Chondak's campaign setting, and it's the phase is split up, and in that phase it lays out what you can and can't do for your army. It's a brief overview here. It's 1,000 to 2,000 points, and put more terrain on the table than you normally would. Maximum of one with one model with the artillery, tank, or monstrous creatures. I'll double check that actually. Okay, so it's one unit with either the artillery, tank, monstrous creature special rules, and then the following stuff is banned: fortifications, immobile units, heavy units, drop pods, subterranean assault, flyers, super heavies, primarchs, or vehicles with greater than 3 hull points. Yeah, so that's sort of quite restrictive, but also there's a few bits that you can get around. We have Centurion type rules. So just to clarify, Centurion was a gaming kind of set of rules made up by the Aussies down there. Ive Horace published them. I think other people were involved, could be wrong, but they had an army list creating kind of set of rules they called Centurion. Other people, and myself included, have looked at those rules and tweaked them slightly, and the way I look at Centurion now is Centurion is a type of game, more like Shadow Wars is a type of game. So yeah, Centurion is a type of game rather than a specific list building set of rules. So for instance, in mine I will allow 1 or 2 rhinos, that kind of thing, because I like that feel, and I don't think one or two rhinos in a game. I don't think it's causing any major problems for some of the lists you can still build. So that's why I would do that. So Centurion is this level of game that's designed to kind of echo back a little bit on second edition, but also within that, as part of that, is put the focus back on Marines and Dreadnoughts rather than super heavy tanks and huge monstrous creatures units and things like that. And within that, there are heavy restrictions on monstrous creatures and other stuff. And this is a kind of similar kind of thing. It's interesting to see Forge World approach it like this. And what I would say is that Centurion kind of rule set is guidelines for people to use, and is, you know, very much, it's as being a third party product. It doesn't have to it hasn't got a responsibility that rules in rulebooks have, and that doesn't demean it in any way. But when Forge World puts something out, it becomes people can read it very literally, and so they've got to be aware of that. And now this is in a narrative campaign, and they clearly state through that section it's all about narrative. And so when you're approaching this, there is that assumption that you are maybe almost talking to your opponent, but you've certainly got your eye on creating this narrative environment, and so getting your armies to a level where they're similar or what have you. And so when you look at things like maximum one unit with the artillery tank monstrous creature type, you know, yes, in a 1,000-point game that means you could bring 3 Castellax, but because you're playing a full-on narrative campaign which is laid out, you maybe hope that you don't bring those models if your opponent hasn't got the things to deal with them, which they're unlikely to have at that points level. So they're fine, I think is the term. Fine. There's still things you can do. There's still vehicles out there with less than 3 hull points that you can cause. You know, you can squadron up a unit of 3 hull points. I'm trying to remember what there is now, but there's still things you can do within this if you really wanted to. But as I say, the point is that you don't. The point is that you're focusing, and it even says focus there on bikes and things like that. And like lots of jet bikes at small points can be lethal. So let's not pretend that there's ways of making armies here which are very powerful, because it doesn't do that. There are so many ways to approach this that can be done. I like them. I think they're all right. I think for my events, I will use my version of Centurion rules going forwards, which I will continue to tweak as it's needed. I think there's lots that can be played around with there till you've got what you need right. In theory, in this you can take major primes. They are, they're as powerful as Praetors. In the right builds, they can do a bit more than Praetors can. And I don't think necessarily having those levels of characters in these point levels feels right all the time. So there's lots of different stuff, but if Forge World were to make a complete list that was completely balanced, that would take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of space in the book. And this is realistically, these rules are here for this campaign, which is supposed to represent Chondax and the war being fought there. This is not a play style supplement with a whole list of scenarios and everything that go with it. It's got a handful of scenarios for this specific thing, so I don't think you should expect too much from it either. But yeah, those are my thoughts on it. As I say, the Centurion type rules I put up I think are quite good. I'm sure there are glaring weaknesses. The problem is you don't want to have a list of rules which is 3 or 4 pages long as you list everything that's not allowed to be taken. Again, that kind of defeats the object of what you're trying to do. But yeah, it's cool. It's there. It's there to be used if you want. We've got lots of resources outside of Centurion. There's lots of stuff. If you go and look at things like the Nova Open events, they had 500-point zone Mortalis Force games, and they had rules for taking understrength units and things like that. So there are a lot of resources out there that you can lean on, and if you do want something different, then go and find them. Be interesting to see where they are, but you can head on to somewhere like the Crusade and Heresy group on Facebook, and and ask for different ways of playing the game, and I'm sure people will be more than happy to help you. But I am done. We have talked long enough. I will come back after the music and we'll talk to Michael. And joining us once again, we have Mr. Michael. How you doing, man?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks.
Excellent stuff. And we're getting back onto the Primarchs series of books, but with a little bit of a jump.
Yeah, this is my fault. So I still haven't read Vulcan. It's been on the shelf. I just haven't got around to reading it. So rather than skipping just one, I thought maybe we'd skip that one and Korak. So we'll come back to the pair of them, and we'll go on to Angron and Conrad Curze.
Yeah, absolutely. So, pretty self-explanatory. It's all good. We'll get around to it in time. And
it'd be nice to get back to those. In the meantime, we can at least both talk about these two, because we have both read them.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll start with Angron, Ian St. Martin. So what else has he written? Did he do the Curze short? Was that Ian?
He did the Curze short audio for Advent a year and a half ago, something like that. What was that called? A Lesson in Darkness, I think.
Something like that. Titles are starting. I reached the point about a year ago where titles started to become a little bit less meaningful because there's just too many of them.
So many. But I think for the Heresy, that before Slave of Nuceria had come out, I think that was the only thing he'd done Heresy-wise. He's since done this novel and then a short story called Ghost of Nuceria, which essentially comes, well, I suppose just sits alongside the novel. But he'd mostly done 40k before then. So he'd written about Death Watch and Lucius the Eternal and other bits and pieces. Lots of really good stuff. But yeah, this was his first sort of full, decent introduction to the Heresy.
Yeah, and we get not a full origin story, although it covers a fair bit of it. It's not purely an origin story, is it?
No, I mean, I guess Angron was one of those Primarchs. I've certainly heard people say, but we know what happened. Like, we've seen a bit of his origin story. Obviously, Matt Farah and Aaron ADB have covered some of that in the past with Outer to Share and Lord of the Red Sands and things like that. And we've seen quite a lot of Angron in things like Betrayer. But this one is sort of half origin story and like pulling the timeline back a bit. And then half, I guess, well, in quote-unquote present day, by which sort of Great Crusade era...
Yeah, defining...
Angron has been found. He's making his stamp on his legion, but he's not yet he's not fully embraced the Legion is still trying to figure him out. So there's a sort of two time periods, but we do get quite a lot of what you might call an origin story. So his time with the High Riders and that sort of stuff, just sort of balanced out.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're covering these kind of two key points. And I think people say we had the origin story, but it was such a basic origin story. Like, found, made a slave, died. Just imagine. What's his name? What's it based off of? I am
Spartacus.
Spartacus, that's the one. Yes, the word. That's the one I was thinking of. Claudius, but that's a different TV show. Yeah, so we had, it's Spartacus in space. But I mean, yeah, they've been. That's not really an origin story. That's
no. This definitely fleshes it out, doesn't it? It goes. Yeah. It's inevitably, because it's a short novel rather than a bit of a short story. There's more depth. There's more detail to it. It's much more of a character-focused piece than anything else. And I think what it does really well is it gives us that backstory, but it's not just a factual exercise. It's not just, okay, great, so now we know more about what happened. We know more about the implications. And what it does that I haven't read before is it sort of humanizes Angron and shows us what he was like before the nails were implanted. Because we knew that the High Riders had implanted the butcher's nails into him, and that set him on this path. But I don't think, I may be wrong, but I don't think we'd seen what he was like beforehand. And I don't want to say too much about it because it's a bit of a spoiler, but it's certainly interesting to see a little glimpse of his potential and maybe an interpretation of the role he was originally intended to play by the Emperor, which is not the role he ended up playing. I think that's safe to say, right?
Yeah, there were some definite kind of ooh moments in discovering what he was like pre-nails, and those kind of what if thoughts enter your brain. Because they're very different people, which is understandable. Yeah,
I think absolutely. There's a real sense of that tragedy, which the heresy should cover. That's what the heresy is. It's a tragedy. It's that glimpse of what might have been but could never be. And that's exactly what you get with Angron here. And you get that sense, which we'll maybe talk about in a bit when we flip to the other side of the story, but you get that sense that Angron can be seen or interpreted as a bit one-dimensional because of the nails and so on and so forth. As, he's the monster, I guess, alongside Curze. Maybe we'll talk about that as well later. But what this does is, because it shows what he was like beforehand, it shows that he wasn't a monster from the beginning, which gives a lot of extra emotional weight to his story. And I think adds that sort of context of why maybe he did the things he did. And again, just that sense of tragedy of, but this didn't need to have been the case, which is great.
Yeah, definitely. And I think he handled it quite well. It could be really easy to get too cliched with
for sure.
The fighting pits and stuff like that. But the way that Angron gets from point A to point B is well handled. And
it's about his relationships with the other slaves, isn't it? So obviously it's set to the backdrop.
And his attitude towards the High Riders.
Exactly, but I think that's the sort of the backdrop. So it's a given, really, that he's going to be angry with them and resentful and all those sort of things, which we see transferred along into his character down the line. But I think it works so well because it's focused on his relationship with the other slaves, what he's trying to do with them, and how he bonds with them. Because we know that a big part of Angron's difficulties with the Emperor was that he was saved, in inverted commas, which he sees as ripped away from his destiny, while his brothers and sisters were killed. But maybe without reading this book, you might struggle to understand how a Primarch, especially a Primarch with the butcher's nails in his head, is really going to empathize with a bunch of slaves. But what this does, I think, is sort of contextualizes that and helps you understand by really focusing on how they fit together and what he means to them and what they mean to him.
Yeah, and within all that, it's so 30k. We're talking about Great Crusade and how everything was hopeful and all this, and then you get to a planet like this one, and it's that quick reminder that actually it's always been there, under the surface. The Imperium is a terrible place.
Totally, that's absolutely right. But I put in my review that I think the Primarch series up to this point, and all of the other little snippets we've seen of the Great Crusade in the wider Heresy series, have had that sense of hope underneath. Now, we know it's tragic hope because we know it's not going to happen. But there still was that sense of hope. And I think that's right, because it's what the characters were going through at the time. But Angron never had that hope. From the minute he landed, really, certainly from the moment that the nails were implanted, hope was not a feature of his life. And so I think this becomes a bleak book because of that, but a sort of bleakly powerful one, because it goes against that grain, and there's not a jot of that, oh, isn't this lovely rose-tinted Great Crusade sort of thing. You just don't get it.
No.
That works for his character.
Not at all. And this Angron is someone who's extremely I don't know what the word is, but you feel that empathy for him. You see a little bit of that potential at the start, and actually it's a little bit of a way through the story where the real kind of mic drop moments occur.
Yeah.
When you're like, oh, okay, that wasn't necessarily expected, or what have you, and what could Angron have been.
Exactly, and you're right. It's part way through, so it's not just crowbarred in at the beginning and then swept under the carpet. It's a natural evolution of where his character's going. You get that mic drop is a good sort of representation of it. You just get that moment where the penny drops, and you realise. I mean, bearing in mind that the Heresy, the Primarchs, they're all written. I think we should interpret them all as being written from unreliable narrators.
Yeah.
So this is an interpretation of it that I personally like, and I'm very happy to run with. But another author might come and apply a different interpretation to it later down the line. But this particular interpretation makes him as sympathetic a character as I've ever seen, far more than previous depictions, and I think a surprisingly sympathetic character.
Yes, because even in 30k, Angron, even though he's been through what he's been through, like he still acts like an absolute douche. And that's fair enough. And you can kind of think, okay, right, so we're going to get the Angron story. He's going to be the slave king, and we're going to go through it. And it starts off a bit like that. And the whole Spartacus thing's in there, and a little bit more, and it's done well. And then that has those one or two moments, that particular one moment where it's like just switches things on its head a little bit, and it's like, well, okay, I was settled into this, my view of what Angron was before this happened to him, and actually, without, had he been given someone to guide him, fallen onto, Guilliman's planet, onto thingy, then it could have been, a very different journey.
Absolutely, and I think that's the nicely balanced. Like you said, that at the beginning, and certainly for parts of it, you see that slave king, you see that proud, angry character. That we talked before about how it's a sort of a split narrative. The sections on New Syria are showing him developing into that, or into what will become that once he meets the Emperor.
Yeah.
The sort of Great Crusade era parts are very much the bitter, angry warrior dealing with the fact that for him, his legion is a disappointment. They can never live up to the sort of the idealized figures that he has in his mind of his original brothers and sisters in the fighting pits. And so I guess the whole thing, the story, the main thrust of the story, the Great Crusade era, is this idea that, which we know, that Angron wanted to shape his legion in his image, and he insisted that they find a way to replicate the butcher's nail so they can experience the world as he does, which is a pretty hateful thing to do. However, by seeing his progress and his journey up to that point, I think you get a certain insight into that, and it allows, whatever you think of Angron, it allowed Ian, as the author, to have the pre-Great Crusade stuff, so all that sort of sympathetic element of Angron changing and developing, alongside where he is as we recognize him, sort of pre-ascension, pre-demonhood. But then tucked in there, you've got Mago, so the Centurion, who sort of represents the warhounds, and he's essentially trying to push back on against those elements of the Legion that just want to be like Angron.
Yeah.
They all want to please him. They all want their father to love them in the same way that all the legions want to be accepted by their fathers. Angron's way of doing that is pretty grim. Some members of the Legion throw themselves headfirst into doing what he wants. So trying to find a way to implant the butcher's nails safely, or an Astartes version of those. But then Mago he's trying to cling to what the Warhounds were, and he's then a similarly sort of sympathetic character to the early Angron, again showing what they could have been under other circumstances. So that sort of reinforces the same message, I think.
Yeah, and within all that, we get people like Khan, who rides that weird path where he's a little bit of both.
Exactly.
Which is quite useful. And yeah, we get this this view of the Warhounds pre being moulded into shape, and quite quite an interesting legion. I can't remember if I'd read it or not about them walking towards their enemy.
Okay. I hadn't come across that.
Yeah, I remember reading it, thinking, oh, and then trying to remember if I'd read that bit or not before.
Yeah.
You got a very different view of the Warhounds from obviously.
But you saw how they might have turned into what they turned into.
Yeah.
So, like I said before, that idea that if they were already monsters, if they were already awful, just raving berserkers, the addition of the butcher's nails wouldn't have had an emotional impact in the same way, and really it wouldn't have had a narrative impact. Well, they're just the same thing, just a bit angrier. That sort of doesn't give you that much. So I think by having Mago and his element of the Legion trying to cling to the Warhounds and the philosophy, the ideology of the original Legion, you again get that sort of impact. And yeah, you get to see their ways of war. And just their way of being, and the way it's gradually coming to clash with the other elements of the Legion who just want to throw that away and move with the times and become what Angron wants them to be. And also, that's awesome.
Yeah, and also the kind of the emotional stress of Angron demanding what cannot be achieved, and then desperate to live up to and prove themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it is a book about change, isn't it? It's about the Legion through different methods trying to adapt and change and become what Angron wants them to be, in the same way as it's about him being forced to change. And the sort of different ways, that sense of identity, and the pretty nasty things that happen. As you say, I mean, the nails they're not like Imperial tech. So some pretty horrible things happen. I think I remember you talking to me about reading the opening scene and feeling a bit ill.
Yeah, so right at the start, there is some pretty descriptive content of the process of trying to put the nails in. And, I can't watch things like real life surgery. It might be a documentary on surgeons or whatever. And as soon as they start doing too much, my brain starts to go into overload about what that must feel like. And I had that reading that book. I think it's pulling the cranium apart was the real kicker for me. And at that point I thought I'm going to enjoy this in a weird way.
Yeah, it's definitely that. I don't know what the term is.
Visceral.
It is visceral, but it's that sense of enjoying something and being horrified by it at the same time.
Watching a car crash.
Yeah, it is genuinely brutal and a really powerful, sort of troubling start to the book that isn't necessarily seen through. It's not the whole book is not like that. Thankfully, I don't think I could have coped with the whole thing, but it's very powerful, and I think what that does is that lays the stakes out. The point is that it's not just a case of Angron goes, right, you are the nails and then we'll be buddies. I mean, that doesn't work that way anyway, but the process of getting to that point of being able to have the nails and who chooses to test them out and what the implications of that are going to be, it's powerful, it's disturbing, and that sort of should be, I think, because the heresy can be a little bit, at times, I guess, a little bit sanitized. We don't see too much of the really visceral, really gross stuff because Black Library doesn't do that. It doesn't go for extremes, even though you might argue that 40k is an extreme. In terms of visuals, doesn't do that. I think this is about as disturbing a scene as I've come across in a BL book.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder that it's that this universe is X-rated, and we're seeing the 13 version, of that, and it's good. And it also, it sets up that there is this price to pay to do it, and every single one who knows this price is willing to do it. Almost all the Legion are willing to go through it, and Khan is the guy that we get to see kind of really push when push comes to shove, and they think like bad stuff can happen when when these and they're willing to test it out, and Khan's there, being Khan, being the leader that he is, and there's that brilliant piece in the book, which anyone read it, I thought it was genius piece of work for those couple of pages, which, as I say, just in case you haven't read it, I'm not going to spoil it, but it was a real nice touch, something I haven't seen.
Yeah, it's a way of
Black Library did that.
It's a very clever idea, and I think it's a way of representing the enormity of what happens and the implications of the nails without actually showing someone, chopping bodies into pieces and eating them and all that sort of stuff, like, which you don't need. This way is much more powerful, even though it doesn't actually show you what happens.
That's it. It's like all great horror films. They never show you that moment, and they let your mind work it, and therefore that horror film is as scary as your brain can make it. And yet they've done, they never show you the blade going in Psycho, but they don't need to. So there's that very simple process, which it works fantastically.
I agree, and it's interesting you mentioned Khan. I think the Primarchs, it must be a tricky balance to find as an author of which characters do you include, because they're not 100,000 word novels. They're short novels. They need to be quite compact. This obviously has to have the Primarch in, so it's got Angron. Khan is there, but he's not really a viewpoint character, or not really.
No,
but he's there. He ought to be. It's valuable to have him there. He represents a certain aspect of the Legion very well, but he's not the main protagonist, really. So it's Mago, the Centurion, who sort of wants to not recapture, but I guess just cling on to the glory days of the Legion, and then a librarian who sort of facilitates the flashback to New Syria sort of sections. So I guess it's Angron himself and Mago as the viewpoint, but Khan's there as a nice presence. He ties the whole thing together quite well, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. And we haven't really touched about that psychic, the element of what's going on, which was again as another lovely little like tool that was used.
Yeah, I think it's opened up. I think it works really well.
Yeah,
I think it's the only real way of doing it without just basically going, and here we'll have flashbacks just for sake of it. It just about works in terms of suspension of disbelief. I mean, it's ever so slightly convenient, but I think it is powerful, it's effective, and it's what suits the story.
Yeah, and there aren't many ways for Angron to be that reflective.
No, absolutely.
If it was another Primarch, they could tell the story. But Angron would never tell the story. But it also allows, and it plays into moments in that as well.
But I think the only other way of doing it would have been to have set the entire thing at that time and just seen it through his eyes. But that would have meant you'd have lost the Great Crusade era. And I would argue that there's as much empathy there's as much sort of emotional impact in Mago's story as there is in Angron's. It's a reflection of Angron, and it's a similar but not the same sort of sense of tragedy to that. And that when you get to the climax of the book, I think that actually has a real power. Mago's decisions, and those who stand with him, those who stand against him, and the sort of the conflict that generates. So I think it was a slightly convenient tool, but I think it was the right tool to use. And pulled the whole thing together for me really well. I would have to say I think this is my favourite of the series so far.
That's fair enough.
I think it works on every level, and I think it changed my expectations of the characters in a way that the best Heresy books do. Something like Legion, where you read it and go, wow, I just didn't expect that. It doesn't maybe quite have the same sense of mind being blown, but it has more emotional heft. But the Primarch series doesn't always do that. I think they're always interesting, but this one fully adjusted the way I saw the Legion and the Primarch, and I think it's phenomenal for that.
The only small issue I had with it, and I haven't looked into it, but right at the end of the book, we have a Legion turn up, and essentially, I wasn't sure on the timings of that because, actually, no, stuff it. We'll talk about it because this is set just before the Night of the Wolf, so which is where Russ is basically told to show Angron a lesson in kind of winning the war, not just the battle, and it just felt, and it could be me being completely wrong on this, but it just felt like that the Legion that we'd seen wasn't the Legion that Russ had been told to go and sort out. But that was the only thing. Maybe I don't know why the decision was done to do it that way, but it felt just a smidge off. But
fair enough.
But that could be my misinterpretation of it. To be fair, I haven't fully checked it out. But yeah, no, it was a fantastic book. It's definitely up there.
Yeah, it's absolutely worth getting. I'd love to see Ian come back to these characters. So there is a short story that sort of accompanies it that I think works if you've read the novel. I think might not work quite so well without the novel. Sure. I think it's called Ghost of New Syria.
Where's that?
And basically it's set immediately after the point at which the Emperor whisks Angron away. I mean, immediately after. Sort of teleport flare story starts. And it just adds a tiny little bit extra to that. Entirely not essential, but a nice little touch. But I would love to read, once the main stuff's over and the siege is finished and all that sort of thing, I think the Warhounds, seeing a bit more of that foreshadowing, going back in time, Great Crusade era stuff, maybe either side of the nails. I don't know. I just think these characters are so well thought out and well executed that I could read Ian writing that sort of stuff any day.
Absolutely. And so Ghost of New Syria is in the 2019 short story collection.
What's that? Like an ebook collection?
An ebook collection, yes. There's an e-short, so you can get it independently. Black Library Celebration 2019. There we go. Just trying to remember where it was from.
Right,
so it was from the celebration.
It came out in February. It's not yet in an anthology, a physical anthology. So if you're not an ebook fan, patience is in order, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, we still haven't heard anything, or as far as I'm aware, nothing's been confirmed about what's going to happen with additional short stories, whether they're Primarchs or Heresy. Now that the siege is in motion, I'm sure that will come to light eventually. Yes,
who knows? But yeah, I just wanted to make sure that was clear. Awesome. So that's Angron done.
Yeah, and it's just worth pointing out on Goodreads, it's had 92 ratings, averaging 4.26. So I don't think we're the only people who think it's a very fine book.
No, absolutely, and certainly would. If I saw Ian's name, I'd be much more inclined to pick up a book now.
Well, I mean, that's a great testimonial in itself.
Absolutely. Groovy. So we should move on to Angron and Curze, The Night Haunter by Guy Haley.
Book 12, and if I'm not mistaken, Guy Haley's third instalment. So he wrote Perturabo and Corax previously.
Yeah.
We've talked quite a lot about Perturabo in the past. Obviously, we'll come back to Corax. this one for me was unconventional, shall we say.
Definitely.
I think it's really interesting, very effective, but not... I mean, I don't know what I expected, but it did slightly throw me. So it's essentially... It's the story of Curze's final hours, I suppose.
Yeah.
So we know, we've seen in... I don't know, is it... It was either...
Runestorm.
Well, no, I was more thinking it was either in Saispuria's Night Lords book or one of Aaron's trilogy that we've seen the death of Conrad Curze.
I can't remember.
You know, he all the way through, he knew what was going to happen. He knew that he was going to get killed by an assassin sent by his father. So that's kind of a given. And I don't think it's a spoiler to say that, because it's in the background. It's been in other books before. So this book essentially is Curze's final hours as he's waiting for that to happen. And it's about how he chooses to use that. So he's reflecting on his life and the choices he's made and the path he's been on to get to this point. And he's sort of trying to speak to his distant father.
Yeah, there's he's the way Curze does, and the difference between Curze and Sanguinius. Curze tries to justify his actions in a way that allows him to act as he wants, and this is him doing that, and in some ways can be quite persuasive, but it's very much as someone who can lie to themselves quite well. I can understand it, but this is essentially what he's doing, isn't it? It's
so he's sort of built
an effigy.
He's built an effigy, I think that's a good word, of his father. And he's, I don't know, final confession, justifying himself, trying to justify himself to his father, trying to get across his point that none of it was his fault. He was made this way. His father, the emperor, was more of a monster than he was. If you just accept that the emperor set him on that path and wanted it, then, maybe things would have been different. And then in order to do that, narratively, what Guy does is tell various snippets of Curze's life. One, I suppose the longest one of which, as you mentioned before, sort of touches upon what happened to Curze at the end of Ruinstorm, where Curze was at that point, and how he got from there. I don't want to give too many spoilers on that, because people might not have read Ruinstorm.
Yeah.
But how he got from there to Sagualsa, I don't know if I'm saying that right, the world that the Night Lords claimed as their own, and where he was found by the assassin. So that's the longest of the arcs, but there's various stories going on. So the snippets of characters, get to see various Night Lords who've named characters who have been in the series so far, and they're Curze thinking back, using those moments or those series of moments to justify himself to his father. So you get that sense of sort of scattershot, disturbed, twisted sort of mindset of his through a bit of a juxtaposed, sort of jumbled up narrative.
Yeah.
And that really works because it represents the mental state of Curze, who is occasionally lucid but often not. And he's quite powerful with that. Personally, I find it, at least for about a third of the book, a bit tricky to figure out quite what was going on until I settled into the rhythm of it and I realised, fully understood where this was going and just sort of sat back. But even when I was thinking, this is a bit puzzling, it was still interesting stuff. And I think it's whether or not you sympathise with Curze in any way, it's interesting to get inside his head a little bit.
Yeah.
Just not too far.
Always a bit worried about people who sympathise with Curze. But yeah,
but
I'm only playing. But it's...
I think the point on that, though, is that taken as a whole, it's hard to sympathise with him. Taking step at a time,
yes,
there are moments where you think, you know what, actually, in isolation, if I can't agree with him, I at least understand why he did the things he did.
And there are, and it's it's well done in that respect, and most of Curze's story is well done in that respect. In that, if you took each isolated incident and said, but the Emperor did this, but the Emperor did this, then you can understand individual choices. You might not agree with them, but you can understand them to a point. But and all the time I'm reading this, every time you hear a Curze story, you're like, but you chose to do that. Life dealt you a bad hand, but you still chose to play it even worse. And every step, and that's what's watching. The interesting thing is, I had a friend message me and say, basically he said, was the Emperor talking to Curze at the end, or was it his own voice? And I'm like, well, that's up to you to decide, really, because it could easily be either.
I think it could, and that ambiguity is going to frustrate some people.
Yeah,
I think there will be probably a large number of people who, understandably and justifiably, would like answers and come to this book hoping that they'll be able to read it and go, great, now I understand. This is what happened. I get that. I can sympathise in many respects. This is not the book to give you that.
No.
I think what Guy's done is he's carefully trodden that line of ambiguity. So your own perceptions and preconceptions essentially are left to inform that final decision. So was he justified in any way? Was it always inevitable? Could he... He obviously could have made different choices. If he had made different choices, would they have made a difference?
Yeah.
Was the Emperor right? How much of a monster is the Emperor? All these sort of things. Like, say, there's a moment where the Emperor, in inverted commas, speaks to him. Is that a psychic manifestation of the guy on the throne? Is that just another fractured element of Curze's psyche? It's entirely up to the reader to make those decisions. You can come away with whatever decision you really want. The back of it.
I think, like most of these, that's a weighted call, but it still leaves that element. Maybe it's an 80-20 call, but but that an 80-20 call comes up, or a 20-80 call comes up one time out of five. So they are. I think they are weighted a lot of the times when we're reading some of this stuff, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's 100% correct. As I said, I do think if someone jumped to the defence of Konrad Curze too vigorously and too often, I would start to question my relationship with that person. Because
I think that's entirely fair.
At some point,
it's hard to question whether or not any of his methods were objectively, by the standard of us, as in modern humans, moral, ethical, the right thing to do. I guess we don't live in the 31st or 41st millennium, so we're never going to have quite the same perspective as the people in universe. But even like in any situation, it's really hard to justify that. But I think the interesting stuff comes down to, but would a different character under different circumstances being asked to do the same thing?
Yeah. And
what decisions would they make?
And in some ways, the question is about Curze. Is he right to give in to what he believes he is? Or should he fight against it at all times, even though he might believe that he is that being? That is that fight to be someone better? Is that against the nature of himself?
He's even capable of it.
And all those kind of things that come into question. And the good thing about Guy's writing here is you can reflect that back in a set. Like a lot of good writing, you can see, we don't have to, as you say, we don't have to deal with growing up on Nostromo as a super engineered child of the night and murder and death. But when we're faced with two options in real life, and your family members, done something, and you're like, you've got two ways to react to it. It's a similar process on a much smaller scale, and it reflects back at you, and I don't necessarily think Guy's writing always does that. I think sometimes it's a little bit more straightforward, but and that's not a bad thing. But with Curze, one of the better things about this novel was that aspect of real questioning of character and how what we're born with and what's nature versus nurture and all that jazz.
I think it was essential. Really, it would be a disservice to the character to just say, well, he's obviously a bad one.
Yeah,
like we know he is a bad one, but it's not as simple as that.
Yeah.
And so, guys added a little bit of complexity to it. And I would, like you say, I'd be worried, certainly surprised, if too many people come out and think, oh, Curze did nothing wrong.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's not the case.
Well,
but
they say it about someone else who obviously did lots wrong. So,
But it just, I guess it makes it a more compelling and interesting story than just a straightforward, here's a guy who does horrible things.
Yeah.
I think the particular narrative of going through and seeing the impact that he had on his legion, the impact his legion then had on him, his relationship with them, how he saw Nostromo, all those sort of things. They're really interesting. And it does give you a glimpse into his mind. I wouldn't want too much of a glimpse into his mind, but it gives you a bit of it. So I think it's really well done. To me, go for it.
So it's not necessarily a book. When I lined the prime marks up and you said pick 3 books to go and read now, it's not up there for me in those terms. So I thought it was good. As you say, I thought some bits of it were a bit okay. Like where are we going? How are we getting where we're going? Things like that.
I think that's exactly right. And it's that scattershot nature of the narratives. Now, I had a bit of a chat to Guy on Twitter about this, and he's absolutely right that we've seen a lot of Curze already across various stories and series. We knew a lot. It would have been disappointing if it had covered old ground. It had to cover some things. So it must have been a nightmare to plan and figure out how to fit this narrative together. I agree that there are moments where you're thinking, okay, this is interesting, but why? Like, where's this going? I think it sounds a bit harsh. I think it sits together. It hangs together, and largely it hangs together because it reflects Curze. If you'd done that for Perturabo, everyone would have just gone, well, why not just tell a normal story, sort of thing. It works because of the nature of him. You're right. I said at the start, it's unconventional. It's not the easiest narrative to follow. It makes sense. I agree, though. It wouldn't be top. I think I much prefer Guy's other two in a enjoyment stakes. But from an informational perspective of seeing a different side to him, not a better side, just a different side, and seeing a bit more of what happened and certainly finding out how he got from A to B and what that meant, seeing a little bit more of the reality of life, I very much enjoyed. However, you put it up against Perturabo or Angron, which we've just talked about, or some of the other ones which we've talked about in previous episodes, it's maybe hard to justify it against those.
Yeah, I also think there's so Curze is what he is, and that he's not two-dimensional per se, but he's limited because of the nature of what he is. So how many stories can you tell of Curze? Because his arc will almost always be, well, I'm a bad man, so I'll do the bad thing. That's how I was made.
And I think that's probably one of the things that Guy, probably found tricky. I'd have no idea where to start, and determined the nature of this book. I think we talked before with Angron about how that book made you really empathise with him and have that sort of sympathetic relationship with the character where he began, not necessarily where he ended up. You're right. Even on Nostromo, before he'd really embraced all the darkness, metaphorical darkness, is still kind of hard to.
Yeah.
Not even kind of hard. It's not really possible to empathise with him in the same way.
No.
So it doesn't give you quite the same emotional heft.
Yeah.
That some of the other ones do.
And we've seen him at every stage now. So we've seen him from child thing on Nostromo through Great Crusade, doing things other people wouldn't do, through heresy, losing it, being like unleashed in a way, to his death. So there really is like he's very well covered. And if you turn around to me and said, "Oh, there's a Curze story coming out next week," my first reaction would be like, how are you going to tell a Curze story like that we haven't read? And that's cool. I think for now, like until something comes up which is like, here's a new way to look at Curze. I haven't got a problem with him being in a story, but to have a Curze focus story for me would be like, you're going to have to work very hard to make this work. Which is not.
Yeah, I certainly think the sort of story that the Primarchs take, I almost feel like if you did a little short episodic sort of story, just a snippet that's not trying to be a character study, that's not trying to be a judgment of any sort, that just demonstrates an interesting thing which happened, which he did. On a pure sort of entertainment level, I could see that. But I kind of agree that my first instinct, having read this now and sort of close the circle, would not be, oh, great, a Curze story, like it would be if Ian or anyone wrote another Angron story. Yeah. So, yeah, I think I agree.
But it does add a little bit more into the Legion, which is interesting.
It definitely does. I mean, a lot of the Legion, a lot of the named characters are in this. We see Sevatar. I've forgotten all the names. What was the character that guy came up with in Pharos? The Painted Count, whose full name I've now forgotten. Various, essentially that guy's descendants on Nostromo. So for Night Lords fans, I guess it does cover quite a lot of ground. If you are a particular fan, there's quite a lot of cool little snippets to find.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome.
So it's interesting though. I think we've come at both of these in fairly similar ways. For me, Angron definitely, if not my favourite, then up there. Curze was a really interesting installment in the series, and I'm actually glad Guy tackled this rather than someone else. I think he's done a really good job, but not the easiest book to read, and not necessarily a book that I would want to revisit too many times, for example.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. Awesome. So at some point in the future, we will go back and we will look at Vulcan and Corax.
And I guess at some point there's going to be more. I think it's interesting. It's going to be an interesting question to see whether BL push and sort of market the Valdor book as part of the Primarch series.
I think they should, in a way. Well, because they've got the Malcador thingy in there. So I think, you know what, it's already gone past the remit of being 18 books about the Primarchs, which was, the original concept or how it was sold to us effectively.
It was, exactly.
We've gone past that. So actually he's a heresy era major character. He fits this kind of concept, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I have too much of an opinion about it. I think I'm interested to see what the decision is.
It will be big interest. If it's not a Primarchs, then surely it has to become the first kind of standalone, or not standalone, but the first, because we've got the Heresy series, the Siege of Terror, and the Primarchs are all kind of interlinked as they were decided and whatever. If we get a book outside the Primarchs, then it's the first kind of real consolidation of the 30k setting, which in some ways will be a very powerful thing.
I think it depends whether it's pitched as a series, part of a series, or just a standalone book.
Yeah.
Because outside of Valdor and Malcador, how many really big characters are there?
There's a handful.
The Heresy. There's a handful. There's not many.
No.
So, like I said, I don't sort of mind either way. If it's sort of crowbarred in as a number in the Primarch series, I think there'll be some people who are upset.
Oh, well,
interestingly,
I think there'll be
from what I've
upset,
seen,
whatever.
Well, there may well be people upset, whatever. I haven't seen any information about it coming out in limited edition first, like the Primarchs do.
Right.
But I mean, to be honest, there's some stuff on Amazon, and there was the information that it's coming via BL Live and the community post, but there's not been any word from BL since. But people are starting to talk about it a bit more. I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens. And then, of course, irrespective of Valdor, there's 6 more Primarchs books to come.
Blimey. Yeah,
and we don't really know anything about any of those.
No.
I hear that Jim Swallow has pitched an idea for Sanguinius.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's signed off. If that will happen, we'll find out. That's the only rumour that I've heard, in the slightest about any of the rest of them. I've seen people speculating, but there's 5 others, and then these are big names. We've got Sanguinius still to come, we've got Horus still to come.
Yeah.
The word is that the release schedule is going to slow down a bit, because we've got the siege coming and whatnot. But I would have thought we'd find out something relatively soon.
Yeah, we've also seen people who are not linked to 30k talking about writing 30k.
Yeah, for the first time in a long time, some new names cropping up.
So that's intriguing as well, as to whether we maybe get new authors working on the Primarchs, or whether this is the first indication that Heresy era novels will be coming out, which will be a real interesting one for me as a collector, because that puts you that's a very different space.
It is. If it's not a finite number, it is. I would be surprised, beyond Valdor, I'd be surprised if there's much movement at the moment.
No.
At least movement that BL are authorizing authors to talk about towards writing Heresy novels. I think they're more likely to be short stories. Certainly, I saw Peter McLean, who's an excellent author, talk about the Heresy. And I'm pretty sure, he's a busy man with his own stuff. I'd be surprised if he's doing a novel for BL.
Sure.
I think he's far more likely to do short fiction. But of course, there could be audios, which says something a little different again. I guess the point is, we don't know anything yet about the Primarchs. You and I might have to wait a little while before we do another one of these post-Vulcan and Corax. But I guess we can always come back on and talk about news as and when it's announced.
Absolutely, yeah. And we've got so we're middle of August, September, October, November, 3 months, less than 3 months till the Weekender.
Yeah.
So obviously I would expect to hear some news, if not before.
Do you think they'll be quite tight-lipped in terms of specifics?
Yes, I think that's the new way. I think we're in this different place now with Warhammer Community, and I think there's that kind of balance to be struck for them, and they've got to decide where it is. But we shall see, and I'm sure they're going to push Siege of Terror on us at the Weekender.
I would have thought so.
It'll be interesting.
By then, I think The Lost and the Damned will have come out in normal hardback.
Yeah.
The
early
first
wall.
Is it the first wall or the last wall? I always get it confused. The first wall,
I think. Yeah.
That I have a feeling that might be due out this year in limited edition.
Which would possibly. Well, yeah, I don't think they'd put that because of the the sales. I don't think they'd put it out at the Weekender. I think that would be maybe. I don't know when they'll do it. Just before Christmas.
Well, if they put it out before the Weekender, then we'll get some interesting chat with Gav, I'm sure. If it's not released till afterwards, I think they're unlikely to say much, if anything, about it.
Yeah.
Because there's so much pressure on this series, and I think BL have maybe made a bit of a rod for their own back with the uber special limited editions and the not very many. From my perspective, you just pick a number for limited editions. For the Siege of Terror, they could do 10,000 and it'd sell out.
Do you think
that? I think maybe not in
sure.
5 minutes.
I'm really not sure. A lot. So they sold the last one, the Lost and the Damned. They sold out. It took 5 or 6 minutes to sell out.
Yeah. But
still, a lot of people bought multiples. I'm not 100% sure. I only see the odd person asking for a copy on Facebook, on the trading groups. Like, it's not like there's 10 or 15 people who are like, oh, has one appeared yet? There's 1 or 2 people who are like, oh, is there any chance? And
I get that.
So I don't think the balance is that off. I think the first book in a series is always going to be in more demand. And the problem is if they've released 5,000 of them, then people would expect 5,000 of all the others. Because as soon as you don't get one, they reduce the numbers.
You have to be consistent on that. But I think that the point is that irrespective of the number, it's sold out. They've been hugely popular. But then there's so much sort of secrecy around them. And they're hyping it up in some respects, but not actually communicating it in other respects.
Yeah.
That now if a future one is available at an event early, if they start talking about things in advance, I mean, what they can't, they're locked into this now. Like, everyone's done a little interview.
Yeah,
they're all done. Where's the scope for expansion of this? I think it's probably going to be a case of slightly head in the sand. Let's just make sure the authors write the best books possible, and we'll just throw them out there and hope they do well. And then once the dust settles, hopefully we as fans will all be satisfied because they'll have been good books. But then BL can regroup and start going, let's tackle the next thing, or let's talk more about what happens with the heresy, but maybe learn some lessons from it. I'd hope so anyway. Maybe I'm being a little bit naive and hopeful.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's it would be great to sit in on one of their meetings about this kind of stuff, because
wouldn't it just? But I don't think, if you look at the fact, I know we're way off topic, the Primarchs here, but if you look at the fact that the speeding up of getting us to Terror happened, and it's a safe bet to say that it happened at least largely, if not exclusively, because a relatively small but vocal group of the community expressed their dissatisfaction, largely online, but at events and in person and via email and so on and so forth. So I think BL are listening to that. And so whether or not the sales and editorial talk to each other and all that sort of stuff is irrespective, I think that they must be aware that there's a little bit of a sense of a dissociation, really, in that the limited editions drop, and then there's this long wait for the normal ones to drop, and then there's a long wait for people who want it in paperback, and it's maybe not quite worked the way they wanted it to, because the decisions were made historically that they've had to stick to. So I think when the next thing happens, or when the heresy turns into a setting, or whatever happens next, I think some things like release schedules and that sort of stuff might tweak a little bit.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I can see that. It's interesting times for them.
It is, for sure. The good thing is the books are still coming out in good quality. We've talked about 2 Primarchs books, wildly different, very different approaches, but both really thought-provoking. I don't know how long we've talked for, but a fair amount. About 2 short books. Yeah. We haven't even talked about things like, the Lost in the Damned, which is a whole other conversation. So there's plenty to talk about.
We'll do that another day. Don't you worry about that. On that note, we should probably wrap this up.
Let's call it.
Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, as always.
Excellent. And we'll take some music and head towards the outro. Well, you've done it. You've made made it to the end of another show. I just want to say I am looking at switching my mics out. It's been one of those things I think I've been a bit in denial of doing. I bought some new little bits of equipment, and hopefully we're going to be swapping over, listening to some of this show, particularly this mic, this setup, my voice. I think some of my settings got knocked, whether by me or a cat, and I'm not. If you've listened more than once, you're well aware that I'm very much an amateur at this. I think we can try and sort things out, but I don't really know what I'm doing a huge amount with that desk. So we'll be swapping things out and hopefully improving that. So thank you for bearing with me on that. During the opening of the show, I did mean to mention Warhammer TV, but I completely forgot. They did a Horus Heresy reading order segment a couple of weeks ago, and I've only recently went back and watched it, and I don't want to talk too much about it. It's Black Library, Games Workshop themselves, they're going to suggest that you read every book, because they're not going to say one of their books isn't particularly good or anything like that. So obviously you go in expecting that. Anyone who doesn't is being a bit foolish. However, I think if you haven't read any of the series, or people who are talking about watching it who haven't read or don't know some of the bigger elements, as they went through the books, they kind of spoiled some stuff. And now I think like 90% of the people are going to be aware, but actually there are a few people out in the hobby who aren't intimately aware of the background of 40k, and I think it's a bit of a shame if they were to go, it's 54 book series, I'm not going to read them all. I'll go and read, I'll watch this, and this will tell me what to read. It's coming from an official source, whereas some of the other reading orders online are just people putting their own points of view across completely independently, much like Michael and I with doing our essentials. Coming from Black Library, coming from Games Workshop carries more weight, and to then have some fairly kind of I had more than a few moments of, why are you saying that? Why are you giving out that information? You shouldn't be giving out that information. So it was just a bit of a warning there. I know they've finished their Tale of Four Wargamers now. I wonder what heresy content is going to replace it, because we've often talked about the need to have that good content on there, regular content, and they've upheld that with what they've been doing. I sometimes think they've struggled a little bit to know what to put on, and we'll have to see moving forwards how they decide to do that. If you have ideas and you want to write off, email them. Let's support them and let's show them possibilities that they can go forward with. But there we go. We're going to be, before next episode, we'll have done the Reckoning of Dalen Prime, so hopefully we're going to have some chat about that on the show. If there's things you want to know, feel free to ask questions, and we can see what we can incorporate into the show. Hopefully we might try and get a few people who are at the event to chat. Obviously it's a little bit smaller than previous events I've done there, so there might be that little bit, fingers crossed, there might be that little bit more time. We've got Rob incoming as a spare player, so if he's not busy all the time, hopefully we can get some stuff up online, and my wife will be there as well, so fingers crossed doing some of the admin. So feel free to kind of nudge me to find out what's going on over the weekend, because obviously you know what I'm like with forgetting to update what's going on. And as I said, Blood and Glory tickets are up by the Heresy 2-day Heresy event tickets are up as this is released. The Adeptus Titanicus and other events will be up very shortly if you're listening to this on or near the day of release. So I'll put a link in the show notes, but basically Google Bad Dice Blood and Glory, and it will take you to the website where you can purchase tickets, and the event packs should be up there soon, if not already as well. But yeah, we'll move on. If you have any feedback, greg@theimperialtruth.com, or you can find us on Twitter, imperial_truth, or @Child of Fang. And Facebook, we've got the Facebook groups as well. So hopefully we'll be putting some pictures up on the social media over the weekend from the event, and see some of the cool armies that we've got going on. And we'll see you next time. But until then, you have been listening to The Imperial Truth.